handcuffs because the police ran his name and he had something, else going on, a warrant. But the point is that this guy was suffering at this moment, and there was and the person that called the police felt horrible. She felt horrible that this was the result of this, because she was genuinely trying to help. And so I got to thinking with other people, is like, what if there was just somebody else you could call for a situation like that? And it turns out that in Eugene, Oregon, there's a group called Cahoots, which already is this. It's a city-funded emergency mental health dispatch.
Yeah, it's two people, I believe a registered nurse and a counselor who's trained in crisis intervention, who you could call if you came across someone who was in crisis and who didn't want to call the police on them. Yeah. So that's a really good concrete example of like the types of things that we're trying to build here in Carbondale.
It also kind of raised this question about how people generally interact with the police. And what it really is like we're asking the police to be two contradictory things. On the one hand, they're the people that they're branded as kind of all-purpose problem solvers. You have a problem, you call the police for whatever reason. And then on the other hand, they're the people that you call when there's like a shooting and this really violent situation where you really need somebody with a gun to show up. And so they're asked to be at one and the same time, care workers and violence workers. So the question that's kind of guiding this whole presentation is, why do we ask the same people to do both things? Like, maybe we need people whose job it is to show up with a gun in certain circumstances, right? Because the world is a really terrible place sometimes. And definitely we need people to show up when there's just a problem that happens and you don't have the skills to solve it and you need somebody that's like a cooler head in that situation. But why would we think that these should be the same group of people? And how did we come to think that they should be the same group of people? So the Carbondale Springs initiative to put forward those transformative programs that I talked about: food autonomy, worker co-ops, renewable energy, and care workers, and to fund those programs by reducing the Carbondale police budget by half. Why do we think we can do that? Well, maybe people have seen this graph, but basically this dark blue here, this is the number of officers, sworn officers, people who carry a gun. This is the number of total police employees. The dark blue is the national average for a town this size. This is Edwardsville, Illinois, DeKalb, Illinois, Normal, Illinois, Charleston, Illinois, and this is Carbondale, Illinois. So Carbondale has double the number of officers of the national average in every other similarly sized college town in Illinois, and double the number of total police employees, a little more than double, of both the national average and every other similarly sized college town in Illinois. We also spend about double all of those places too. So this is cost per resident. And let me just say, we're operating with the idea that Carbondale has a population of about 20,000 people. That's an overestimate, very likely. As you know, so university students are counted in the census, and the university population has dropped significantly in the last 10 years. So this is a very generous estimate. But yeah, so the average is $248 per resident spent on police services. Carbondale spends $515 per resident on police services. And that's not including SIU police. As Charlie mentioned, SIU has a full-time police force of its own with 35 employees. So if you include SIU police, this is that Carbondale, including SIU police versus the national average, it's triple the number of police employees in the town. And then there's the police pension issue. So this is a statewide crisis. It's been building for about 5 decades. I don't understand all of the ins and outs of it, but basically what happened a couple years ago, there was a budget impasse at the state level in terms of funding public pensions, and the way that the state solved its problem was by pushing the costs of public safety pensions off to municipalities. So municipalities all around the state are dealing with this massive train wreck of pension costs. For folks that don't know, a pension means you get paid after you stop working until you die. I know young people will never experience that, so it's worth just defining it. So Carbondale spent $10.4 million in the budget on police last year. They also spent $2.4 million on police retirement. And it doesn't seem like that came out of that $10.4 million, or maybe only about $700,000 came out of it. So when you're looking for how they're dealing with the pension crisis and the budget, it's not clear where the money's coming from. But one aspect of it is it's coming from a lot of taxes that the city passes. So every time you pump gas in Carbondale, 4 cents on every gallon goes to the police pensions. What's that?
Yeah, and so like we see this where the taxes, I think, on cigarettes and gas just went up, and everyone is now paying like something.
But those
like
are state. That's a state level tax.
Oh.
So this is taxes that the city itself can put up, and the city actually can only do that because they have what's called home rule status. They only get home rule status if they have 25,000 people or more. Since they don't anymore. When the next census comes out, they will probably lose home rule status. And they'll basically have to ask us all to vote to get home rule status so that we can tax ourselves in order to fund police pensions. Which doesn't seem like a very winning referendum to me. But the thing about the pensions is that they're going up. And based on the estimates in the 2018 budget, they were expected to rise 7% every year. So that means in 10 years, the $2.4 million that they spent will likely double. And then in another 10 years, it will have quadrupled. There's a lot that could happen on this. So I'm not saying that this is exactly what's going to happen. They could pass different laws at the state level to try and solve it. But as it stands right now, basically the police pensions are this train wreck heading toward the center of the budget that there's no plan to deal with. Did you want to say something, Bob?
On this point, Mayor Mike of Chicago met JP last week about the Chicago police pensions. JP told Chicago basically they're on their own. All municipalities are on their own. Well, and then they're going to operate with so it's here.
So it's here. And so what that means is we've got this weird recipe going on, that we have, on the one hand, rising costs for police, on the other hand, a smaller tax base because there's less people in the town. And I want to put forward the idea that that's actually a recipe for disaster, and I want to use the example of Ferguson, Missouri. Everybody knows what happened in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 when Michael Brown was shot by a police officer, and there was an uprising. But one of the things that people don't know is what the condition prior to that was. So this was discovered through a Department of Justice inquiry into the Ferguson Police Department. There was an average of 3 warrants per household in Ferguson. And the Department of Justice also uncovered emails between the police chief and the mayor. The mayor, after the 2008 financial crash, was talking to the police chief and instructing them to raise more revenue through the police force. So the police force in Ferguson was basically turned into a mechanism for looting largely poor, mostly black people in the town in order to keep the revenue up. And this wasn't just in Ferguson. This is something that's been implemented around the country, and it could happen here if we have this situation of a shrinking population and a massive police force that needs to get funds for itself.
Nick, it did happen here under Jody Ogwin.
All right, well, we'll talk about Jody Ogwin in a second.
Oh, I was also going to say that Watts, the rebellion that happened in Watts, California in the late 60s, which started because of a traffic stop that onlookers in the community who were already pretty fed up after living in a circumstance created by white flight of people who held most of the highest paying jobs immediately after the war. There was like a pretty economically desolate environment mostly housing black folks who had immigrated from other places for jobs, and then the police force just kept increasing as social services diminished and people's income got lower and lower, and then one day someone got pulled over, and then Watts was engulfed in flames for, I think, 8 days.
So, thank you. Our basic argument that we put forward last March then was this, that we have more police than we need, we can't afford it, there are other ways that we could serve the community that aren't the police, like care workers. If we cut the police now, then we have the money to redistribute to make the town into a place that's really, really wonderful. And if we wait, it will be too late, because those pension costs will rise and all of a sudden we'll be pouring money into that. But if we cut the police now, in the long run, that can even or lower those pension costs. So this is Mayor Henry's response to our argument, which he gave during one of the, some forum or something. And he had two arguments, basically. The first is that the Carbondale Police Department received over 77,000 calls for service in 2018, and that high number justifies a large police department. And the second is that the community's asked for a lot of community policing, and that's resource intensive, and so you need a large police department. And we're going to go through each of these in turn. The first is, what is a call for service? If Carbondale received 77,000 in 2018, if the police department did, what does that mean? How do you define that? Does anybody know what a call for service should be? Yeah.
911.
Call 911. Anything else? So the police department, what they said is in 2018 they had 77,000 calls for service. And so we're asking, what counts as a call for service? So 911, that would definitely count for as a call for service. But is there anything else that might count as a call for service? Yeah.
They call the service, they would be the
Yeah. No one called, but they should have. So in general, and this is a definition from a group called the Police Data Initiative. They're cops, it's not a wacky definition, but basically it means calls to 911, also maybe non-emergency calls would count as a call for service. What's that?
It's only 8 an hour. I mean, anyway, it's not such a high number.
8 an hour?
Yeah.
Yeah, 77,000, you just did the math.
Yeah, it's only 8 an hour.
Oh, that's fast.
Well, Carbondale has a very expansive meaning of the term calls for service. So it includes the 911 calls and the non-emergency calls, but it also includes every time they stop you, and issue an ordinance, that is a call for service, like a contact. It also includes their administrative work and their report writing. It also includes washing their vehicles.
What?
Yeah.
Yes.
It literally includes everything they do as police officers on the job. So they've taken, and this is not the way that other police departments define this, but this is how they do it. And what's really interesting is that it's changed over time. So back in 2008, if you look at the calls for service numbers, there were 33,589 calls for service in the year 2008. That's at a time in which the university population was over 20,000 students. In 2018, 10 years later, there's 77,032 calls for service at a time in which the university population dipped under 10,000. So 129% increase in calls for service while the population shrunk significantly. That's pretty strange. So we put that out there and we got a very unlikely ally confirming this. Yeah, this is
So this is from the former Carbondale Police Chief Jody O'Gwynedd. It sounds like people in this room are familiar with him.
and we're not saying he's a cool guy.
But he did say this. He said, if there's no mention of contacts, and just an aside, contacts by the police's definition is just like any interaction that they have with a person while they're on duty. If there's no mention of contacts, then all of the interactions are being lumped into the calls for service category, which overinflates the calls for service. Some police administrators like doing it this way because it creates the illusion that the police are really busier than they actually are, which helps in convincing council members and the public that the police are overworked and understaffed and that crime is running rampant. That is how the CPD gets their numbers.
Yeah. And he went on.
He continues.